I was sitting there alone, thinking to myself that I was bored and might watch some videos online. The light in my room was dim, but not dark enough to where I couldn't tell what's around me. I was watching top 10 videos and texting my friends, and I started to yawn. Figuring it's about 1:16 a.m., I might as well get some sleep. I get up off my bed and turn my light off completely. As I was closing the door, now with my lights off, I heard a tap on my window. Thinking nothing of it, I started to crawl into bed. I heard the tap again. At this point, I knew it was more than nothing. I glanced up at my window, and what I saw next chilled me to the bone. You know that feeling? The feeling where your chest tightens, your eyes tear up, and breathing gets hard and your body goes stiff? This thing that I saw in my window stared right back at me. I couldn't move, but I could see its milky gray eyes, pale, with almost no face. It tapped on my window again. This time, its nails slowly sliding to the corner of the window. I finally gasped for air and let out a scream, and I think it spooked it a bit. My roommate ran in at that point and kept asking what's going on, what was that? I gasped for air again and grabbed his arm and pulled him to my window. I too was screaming, what could that be? Look at the window, what is that? We watched as it crawled over to my neighbor's house. I yelled, I have no clue what's going on, but I grabbed my bat that was lying in the corner and started for my door. He started freaking out, screaming about why would I go outside, and I told him I wanted to know what the hell that thing was. I took the bat and a flashlight and walked around the house. I quickly flashed the light at my window, noticing my roommate was still there watching. I put the light on the field between the houses just as quick. It was so cold I could see my breath with every step I took. I started slowing my steps, and as I was shining the light, I caught a glimpse of it. I yelled at it, asking it what it was, but it kept moving and evading the light and crawled under the deck of my neighbor's house. It looked like something I've never seen. It walked on all fours but stood on two legs. Its arms reached almost to its feet. It had no hair and paper-looking white skin, gray eyes with an empty shine to them, and the sounds it made sent shivers down my spine. The clicking sounds it made were slow and steady. I'm assuming it didn't have vocal cords like a human does, because that clicking is all I heard. I gripped the bat harder and slowly walked up onto the deck, yelling for it to come out. I could see its eyes and part of its arms in the shadows. The hands were big, with long claws dug onto the ground. It almost looked like it was going to charge at me, so I started to back up. The clicking sounds were getting louder and quicker. I heard my roommate in the distance asking what was going on, and asking if he should call the police. I couldn't speak at the moment, I was so scared. My flashlight was small and the light wasn't very strong. It was hard to make out what exactly this thing was. But as I was backing up, the deck light was turned on and my neighbor came out to ask what was going on. I told him what I saw and looked back quick to underneath the deck, but it was gone. To this day, I have no idea what it was. To this day, those eyes glancing at me through my window with the tapping haunts me. I don't think I'll ever figure out what it was that night, but I'll never forget. Ever since I got out of high school, I've been all over the country for my job. Old family manors in backwoods of Tennessee to the shiny lights of New York City and the exclusive beachfront resorts of Miami. I've met a lot of weirdos in my days and a lot of good people as well. I thought I'd seen every type of person this grand earth had to offer, from a tech executive worth $1 billion all the way down to heroin addicts trying to get work from us so they could score a high. Well, I met someone or something one hot July night in a park in the wrong part of Alabama that I'll never forget. The crew I travel with consists of about 15 guys, and we hire local labor wherever we go to get the heavy lifting done quick so we can move on to the next job. The company gives us the money to rent motel rooms in whatever town we land in, but we frequently sleep in our vehicles because they let us keep 75% of the money we save on lodging. We travel in a caravan of two F-250s, a 25-foot box truck, and a school bus. Most guys sleep in the bus. The front half of the seats were ripped out and rigged for storage, but the back still had seats, so it was enough for about 12 guys to have their own seat for sleeping. We usually park in some state park's parking lot, or if we can find a place that's walking distance to a bar. One preferably off the beaten path, just so we don't have to talk to cops every day. I'm getting too far off topic here, so back to the point. So, here we all are on a Friday night in the middle of Alabama. The only thing within 2 miles is a bar and a dollar store. We were parked on a dirt service road about a mile from the bar. On the left of the bus was a heavily wooded area of the park, and on the right was an open field. You could see the back of the bar across it. So, we all pile into the bar and start boozing. Around 1 a.m. people start heading back for the bus, and I did too. On the way back, we walked off the road and down the dirt road, not cutting through the tall grass in the hill. This night, there were 3 men in that field. I was standing outside the bus with a few guys smoking cigarettes and telling jokes when I made eye contact with one of the guys and he waved to me. Being the generally nice guy I am, I gave a wave back. All 3 of the men waved again after that. But this is where it gets weird. The 3 men waved back in a strange way, all raising their left hand and tilting their head slightly, slowly waving their hands before they stopped, exactly in sync with each other. I pretty much laughed it off. I was still pretty buzzed and just hopped on the bus and plopped down in an open seat. I put my feet up on the top of the seat in front of me and leaned my head back against the window and was asleep almost immediately. Later that night, I was jarred from my sleep when my coworker Manuel grabbed me by the shoulder and shook me awake. He pointed out the window. On the field side of the bus, I could see the tops of heads running the length of the bus back and forth. I watched quietly for several minutes and ended up kicking the guy sleeping across from me in the ribs, but just hard enough to wake him up. I stammered in my terrible Spanish, telling him to be quiet and watch. And he sat in silence, watching with us. I could see them running the length of the bus, but I noticed something. It was dead silent, besides the light snores of those on the bus. This meant that their footsteps weren't making any noise. It must have been 2 minutes before I finally moved. I pulled my gun out from my backpack and pulled the 2 awake guys to the front of the bus with me. We woke up a couple others and told them to keep watch. I ran down the steps and threw my shoulder against the doors, forcing a hole into the door and jumping onto the dirt below. Followed immediately by 4 guys wielding digger bars and saws. 2 of the guys were yelling at one of the guys at the back of the bus, but I was focused on the guy in front of me. He was running to the front of our caravan. The 2 small trucks were in front of the bus, and the box truck was in the back. The guy I had my focus on ran around the front of the caravan and came down the opposite side. I was gonna stick the digging bar I had across his chest and try to knock him down, but he took off a few feet into the woods. I had the bar raised, and I was ready to spear the guy with it if he tried something. He was a couple of feet from the tree line, but I could see his face clearly in the moonlight. His eyes were bigger than anything I'd ever seen. His lips drawn back like he was showing his teeth. I could still hear my guys yelling at the rear of the bus. I raised my revolver a little bit and aimed to the left of him. There was no need to shoot a tweaker or something if they're not trying to kill you. I just wanted to scare him. This is when it tried to speak. It was the strangest string of sounds I've ever heard. I can't even write them or explain them. They were just inhuman noises. Not even like an animal's. They were so alien. His body gyrated and contorted with each sound, but his mouth didn't move. His mouth didn't open or shut with any noise it vocalized. I shot my gun down into the dirt ahead of me, and this thing screeched like an animal's war cry. It was almost deafening. It turned faster than any human could have and disappeared into the woods. I heard the two other things take off after it, dashing into a thick brush. That was the last we saw of them, probably because we got the hell out of there. My house has always been creepy. Growing up, I've had unexplained experiences starting from the time I was 4 and never stopping. I live in a small town in Kentucky, one of those towns that solely relies on coal and is 5 years behind the rest of the world. In general, the whole town is still covered in thick woods that appear to have not been tampered with in hundreds of years. My house is placed right in the middle of the mountains, surrounded by an extreme amount of woods and even a couple of ponds. And this just gives you the setting for my home, and this is where the real story begins. Growing up, I was never allowed to watch TV shows such as Ghost Hunters or even movies such as The Exorcist in my house because of the weird activity which goes on there. I had experienced it from an extremely young age, and my mom, who has lived in the house her whole life, had also. At that age, I still slept in the room with my mom due to me being afraid of sleeping in this house alone. One night, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the feeling of something watching me. I felt extremely uneasy. I rolled over to look around the room and my eyes locked onto something standing beside my mom. It was extremely tall, but looked like it had a broken back and couldn't stand up completely. It was slouched over and had extremely pale skin and bones sticking out from underneath everywhere due to how skinny it was. It had long claws hanging from both hands. Its face was sunken in and its eyes were complete black holes. A few greasy hairs were visible on its head. It had no clothes, but it had no need for them. It had no genitals or even nipples. I was completely horrified. I rolled over and covered myself up head to toe with the cover. I refused to move or look out for the rest of the night even though I was fully awake. Eventually, my mom woke up that morning and immediately started complaining of her side hurting. She raised her shirt to look and found huge claw marks down her side. It was 3 deep wounds which were extremely inflamed and still bleeding a little bit. I felt horrible, knowing that thing did that to her while I just laid beside her hiding. A couple of months later, I saw the creature again, although not as horrible as the first time. I was woken up to the creature slouched on the floor on my side of the bed. It was watching me sleep. I covered myself up again immediately, but this time I got the courage to peek, and I found it still looking at me. I'm not sure when it finally went away because I didn't dare to look again. The feeling this creature gave the room was horrifying. I got chills and my hair stood on end before even seeing it for the first time. It had the feeling of complete evil to it. I'm 18 now and obviously sleep in my own room. However, I still live in the same house. My mom still sleeps in the room where I witnessed this creature. Almost nightly she has nightmares about something watching her in the room. She has nightmares about something hiding in her paintings and in her walls, or something coming down from the ceiling in her room while she sleeps. There's a specific corner of the room where almost every night the dreams seem to originate. Our cats even refuse to go in that room. I just hope that I never see it again. This takes place in 1976 or 1977 in the Madera area of Clearfield County. This would have put me at about 6 or 7 years old at the time. We lived just above the town of Madera. It was very remote, few homes in that area, and very wooded. My dad would often patrol with the local officers from the Game Commission. I'm pointing this out due to the fact of how he reacted when we saw this thing. He was a big guy, and very little scared him. We often shook our heads when he would go outside at night to scare off a bear with only a pitchfork. He knew wildlife, knew what their habits were, knew if they were going to be a problem on the farm or things like that. On this night, we were awoken by a loud commotion near our front porch. We had outside cats that hung around on the porch, and they would scatter when a raccoon or other animal would approach. When they scattered, it was quite loud, hence the noise that woke us up. I remember hearing Dad giving his typical angry sigh because he had to get up and see what was out there. He had gone downstairs. The house was quiet. We were all waiting to hear the door shut. Instead, we heard Dad let out a bellow. This had us all running for the stairs. He was standing back from the door, gun in hand, and his face was, well, I guess you could say scared. As I've said before, nothing seemed to scare Dad, so seeing that look on his face made us all stand there uncertain. Outside, standing in profile, looking right back at us with no fear. In fact, I remember thinking it was angry. It just looked mean. It was a canine, but certainly not a dog. It looked like a hyena from the front shoulders to the head, but the back end was way smaller than the front shoulders and the head. I don't remember seeing a tail. The fur was odd, sparse and shaggy. It just didn't look like fur. It's hard to explain. The snout was not long and narrow, it was stubby but big, and the whole body was huge. From its back end to its head, it was almost the width of our porch. This would have put it at least 7 feet long. It was huge. It stood looking in at us, then looked out towards the barn, back at us again, and then just simply and very slowly walked a few feet. Then it took off. It was so fast, like literally just seeing a blur of color, then it was gone. We all just stood there. Then Mom asked Dad what it was, and Dad yelled for us all to get upstairs. He stayed up all that night, never went outside to check the animals, never even opened the door. Oddly enough, we never talked about it, and nobody ever mentioned it again. I wish I had more information to give you. However, this does give you a possible timestamp. I spent most of my life up there in that area. It was a unique area for sure. Many things happened up there that were unexplained, and I was glad to move away when I was 33. I do still live in the Clearfield area, but no more forests. We were out on a Navajo Dam road cutting wood. We had turned onto a dirt road on the northeast side. After cutting a few trees at the bottom of a canyon, we decided to go further up the hill to see if we could find any more dead trees. I had a dog and my son with me. We made our way up the hill and it flattened out a little bit. There were a few dead trees, so we decided to stop and cut those as it was getting dusk and colder out. My son and his dog got out and were playing fetch while my brother Chris and I prepped the trees to be cut. As we were about to finish up, my kid came running up the hill and said he found some really neat-looking tracks from an animal. So as I made my way down the hill and towards my truck with an armful of wood, I stopped to look at the tracks. They looked like claw marks in the sand and were in the same direction as where we climbed to cut. As I was looking at the tracks, I noticed I didn't hear my brother's chainsaw anymore. As soon as I realized the motor sound had stopped, I heard a scream. The sound of a shotgun being pumped, then a shot being fired. Before I could even react, Chris came running at breakneck speeds down the hill, past me, and to the truck yelling, "Drop the wood, let's go." My dog was barking, growling, and backing up with hair raised on her back and neck. I shuttled my kid and dog with wood in hand down the hill, threw the wood in the back seat with the child and dog. Needless to say, we got the hell out of there. My brother refused to speak until we were on the main road and almost home. While he was cutting wood, he had the feeling of being watched. Thinking that I was playing a trick on him, he sat his running chainsaw down and went to catch me in the act before I could scare him. Not knowing I was further down the hill with my son, he climbed the rest of the hill and was looking around to find me. He saw us down by my truck and also saw a shadow opposite him by a sandstone cluster to his right. We always carry a gun with us while we cut, because you never know what kind of creatures one may encounter out there. He pumped off a shot to get my attention and also took a shot at whatever it was he had seen. He told me it ran in between a rock and ledge and some bushes. He didn't want to waste time and try to take another shot at it. Before the second shot, the chainsaw stopped because it had run out of gas, which is how I was able to hear the gun being cocked and fired. It scared him so bad that he refuses to go back out that way and collect wood. And always being the skeptic, I thought he was bullshitting me, trying to scare me, but then I remembered the claw marks my kid found, and knowing that nothing scares my brother or my dog. He said the thing he saw was a good 7 feet high, if not taller, and hairy all over with a wolf's face and eyes. He caught a slight glimpse of it before it slipped between the brush and stones. I was kind of laughing at him in my head until I remembered those claw marks in the ground. Me and my two friends decided to go camping in southern New York, up on a mountain. There was a dirt road that runs right down the mountain, then off of it were a lot of smaller off-road tracks that have some really good camping spots. I don't know if you're really supposed to be camping there or not, but there's a lot of fire pits, so people seem to do it anyways. We set up our tent and got a fire going, had a couple of beers, and are bitching about our women, and the sun goes down. We all looked at each other because the woods got really quiet. You couldn't even hear the crickets. Everything just went dead quiet. It felt like there was a lightning storm coming because you could feel the static in the air, and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Jamie started saying that he felt like the air was humming, and all of a sudden there was this real deep bass noise and this bright light in the distance. It flashed up and lit the whole woods. It looked like the light when a real big firework explodes for the first few seconds, but it lasted for probably a minute before it split up into 3 or 4 outer lights and shot back down into the trees. We could see all of the lights glowing out in the woods, and there was a big gust of wind and it was gone. Everything smelled like it had just rained, but it never did. We didn't know what to do, but we figured we would just wait it out, but nothing happened. We thought maybe it could have been a meteor or something, so we left it alone and went back to bitching. At about 2 in the morning, we decided to turn in, so Jamie and I went to go sleep in the tent, but Dan said he was going to sleep by the fire. An hour later, I wake up because Dan is in the tent shaking us, saying that there's something big watching the camp. He said it was about 50 feet from the fire, and he thought that it might be a bear, but it was standing on 2 legs and bobbing back and forth like it was trying to get a better look at him. While he was talking, we heard a loud scream. I've never heard anything like it before as long as I've been alive. It sounded like a pig being slaughtered, but deeper. and so loud it made your ears ring. Next thing I remember was hearing 3 or 4 more things come running towards the campsite and the embers from the fire kicking up and landing on the tent. The things or creatures or whatever they were kept running up to the tent and grunting and running back into the woods. Every once in a while, one of them would scream again and pull on one of the tent poles, dragging the whole tent a foot or two. The tent was collapsing on one side and we didn't know what else to do, so we just started screaming as loud as we could. It only took a minute and then everything was quiet again. We made a run for the truck as fast as we could and hit the gas. When we were leaving, we saw one of those things in the headlights standing in the road. I told Jamie to just gun it, and the thing straightened up and puffed its chest. It must have been 8 feet tall. It had dark gray hair all over its body except the front. That hair was white or yellowish around the chest. Its face looked kind of like a dog, but not really. I know what Bigfoot's supposed to look like, and this was way different from that. It didn't even move when we drove at it. We had to swerve around it or we would have run right over it. We drove back down the mountain to the highway and parked the truck in a gas company parking lot. We were going to tell the cops what happened, but we didn't know if we were camping somewhere we shouldn't be. And we had been drinking all night and couldn't afford a DUI. We just waited for the sun to come up and sobered up. Then we drove back up to get our stuff. There wasn't anything there, and everything was gone. No tent, no cooler, nothing. We told some of our friends what happened, and they won't believe us since we'd been drinking, so we just decided to forget about it. If someone ever wanted to check it out, I could take them right to the place it happened. There's still tracks there from where we peeled out, and lots of big gashes in the dirt from where the tent was, but nothing else. I don't know if it had anything to do with the lights we saw, but it was the weirdest damn thing any of us had ever experienced. And it was definitely not a bear. My wife and I were traveling to the Smoky Mountains from Ohio on an anniversary getaway. We usually avoid highways in our travels and instead prefer the scenic and slower-paced state routes of my childhood. This trip stood out as quite a disaster, as we struggled with both the GPS and paper maps while navigating a route I was at least somewhat familiar with. Navigational errors are not our norm, and we quickly found ourselves having an uncharacteristic argument that got fairly heated, but was nonsensical. It was like we spoke different languages, and were looking at different maps. We eventually found ourselves in increasingly less populated areas and poorer road conditions. For those not familiar with the area, being in central Kentucky, the forest is hilly and expansive, dotted with small towns and the occasional privately owned farm amidst all the federal land. We had eventually quieted down, anxiously following the GPS as it cut in and out. Our anxiety grew until the GPS suddenly chimed in with, "Turn left now." I responded by reluctantly starting the turn, when my wife suggested it must be a shortcut we were unaware of. Upon completing the turn, I slowed, seeing the road took a sudden drop in quality. Potholes large enough to get a tire stuck in, overgrown scrub growth on the edges, and ominous gnarled vines hanging down. The hair stood up on my neck as it does right now while I write this. Bringing the car to a stop, I ask my wife, "Are you sure about this?" As I look towards her, "No, we need to turn around," and she starts to say, but is cut off, almost frozen, staring at her phone. Not in the way a person freezes when terror sends their muscles trembling, but completely motionless. I instinctively slam it in reverse, backing into the position we came, so that I could continue the course we were on. As we reached the end of our reverse turn, I slammed it into drive, but went nowhere as the rear of the early 2000s Lincoln is lifted off the ground. Before I could process what is happening, something charged from the woods to our right. At first, it was a large red blob that moved with a speed and grace that seemed unnatural to its grotesque nature. As it closed the gap, it was clear that it was running on all fours, but only partly so. Its forward movement was agile, but uneven, as it irregularly used its arms with its oddly bent hind legs. It was almost like its limbs were growing, as it eventually came to stand on its hind legs and place its hands on the glass of the window. Up close, I could see what I thought was fur. It seemed more like strands of rotten flesh that grew as thick as a shaggy dog and smelled overwhelmingly of rotten fish and moss. Its hands looked nearly human, were it not for the rotten fur and long claws. The face sticks with me as much as the smell, being somewhat shaped like a human that has its face twisted and pulled forward in a vague, canine shape, with large pointed ears towards the top of its head. Inside its snarling mouth were long narrow teeth that looked almost too large to close. But the eyes were the worst part. Bloodshot and yellow, they leered at my wife with a hunger. A kind of hunger that promises unspeakable things. When you're in flight or fight situations, you usually get that distinct moment of clarity where you make your choice, even if it's one you are ashamed of. In that moment, I felt like a small dog defending my mate from a rabid wolf. I stomped the gas pedal and bellowed hard, "We've got to go now!" And a series of loud noises that sounded more like barks than human noises followed. It jolted suddenly and the rear of the car dropped, leading to a large peel-out, and the creature kept pace with us, scratching at the car and banging on it until we broke 45 miles per hour, driving wildly through the winding country until we saw the lights of a town in the distance. We parked in a well-lit parking lot in the center of town next to a gas station. We busied ourselves as we inspected the car, reluctantly sharing what we thought we saw. She was in tears and sobbing about feeling a pressure in her head and that she was conscious, but paralyzed. Looking under the trunk, I spotted a cracked strut and a lump of the rotten flesh dangling from a frame member. The smell was still overpowering and sent us into a tear-filled hug as we stared at a piece of the filthy creature and realized it was likely at least two of them. The one in the window and the one that lifted the rear axle off the ground. Thoroughly shaken, we sat in the car facing opposite directions and discreetly unpacked our handguns and hid them under our blankets. We waited until 9 or so before setting back off towards our destination via highway. I've never really been a believer in the paranormal. I always try to find a rational explanation for the things I have trouble working out. At least, until last summer. I'm originally from New Jersey. I had decided to take my wife and kids for a vacation. We went to visit my in-laws, who have a cabin in the Canadian Rockies. For the first few days, we enjoyed the peace and tranquility of the country and went on a bunch of hikes and bike rides in the forest around the cabin, during which I didn't see anything out of the ordinary in what must have been a 20-mile radius around the home. The cabin is pretty old and runs a separate generator near the tool shed in the back of the yard, which my father-in-law says has always been temperamental and can create an eerie atmosphere when the lights flicker on and off. So I know better than to be spooked by shadows and bumps in the night. However, one night, around 10 p.m., we were sitting around about to go to bed when the lights completely gave out and the pitch blackness of the countryside meant that we could see literally nothing. Before I could grab the flashlight, I heard rustling outside the cabin, and something brushed the side of the wall by the living room. I tried to put on a brave face for my kids and told them that it was probably a coyote and they should just go to their room. All the noises it made sounded bipedal and quite a bit bigger. Pretty creeped out, I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to the generator, shining the light on the ground to find my way. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw something which terrified me. So much, I don't know if I can even find the right words to describe it. I couldn't make it out exactly. All I could see was a creature in my peripheral vision. It looked human and about 6 feet tall, with ghost white skin. I knew it was staring at me. At this point, I was mustering up the courage to look at it when I shined the light at it. I got a good look at the monster. It's so difficult to portray with words what it looked like, but it was like a man whose skin was too tight for his body. You could see all of his organs bulging through the skin and his bones. It made him almost look like an insect. And what jolted me the most was the fact that it had no face whatsoever, but still had indentations where the eyes should be. A bright light startled the creature and it hunched over as if about to run. This was all I could see in the brief glimpse I got before I dropped the flashlight in fright, and by the time I picked it up, it had darted into the forest. I ran back to the cabin and stayed there for what seemed like forever, making sure it had gone before I went back to the generator. I didn't tell anyone when I went back inside what I had seen. I don't really know why. I suppose to protect the children, and in case my wife didn't believe me. About a week afterwards, I started having a reoccurring nightmare. Every time I would dream about that night and wake up in cold sweats, until I finally confessed to my wife about it. I started seeing a therapist to help me with my sleep. I came across this website looking for other people with similar experiences. I have trouble finding accounts which match what I saw. I'd love to hear any stories about any people who think they have seen what I saw, or who have experienced getting over an encounter with the paranormal. It was the spring of 2006. I was just finishing up my freshman year of college, and a group of 5 of my friends decided to go into the woods for a bonfire. My friend Reed and I were bringing some beer. Another couple brought some hot dogs, and our 5th friend Alton was planning on coming a bit later in the evening because he had to finish up a paper and was going to bring more beer with him when he arrived. Reed, and a couple of friends, and I hiked farther than we normally did. We found a good spot and lit our bonfire. I had a beer or two, and were working on cooking the hot dogs when Alton showed up. He didn't say much, and sat down next to me. We asked him if he wanted a hot dog, and he shrugged. But he did grab one of the beers I had brought earlier. Reed asked him if he had remembered to bring more beer, and he just looked confused. It was the end of the semester, and Alton wasn't a huge talker to begin with, so we just wrote it off. A while goes by. We're talking with the other couple, and Alton is a bit quieter than normal, but occasionally makes a grunt or some noise of agreement. It's starting to get a bit late, and I'm starting to think about heading home. Randomly, Alton throws his hardly finished beer into the fire. Quickly the beer heats up and spews out of the bonfire and hits me on my arm. At this point, Reed and I leave, after saying goodbye to everyone. It had gotten quite dark out, and finding the path is a bit hard.
we finally decided just to walk in the direction of the campus, leaving the path behind. And the forest is mostly new growth, so it's easy to walk. However, there are many small branches and small trees that can get snapped. Not long after we couldn't see the bonfire, we started to hear something following us. Snap, snap, snap. And it continues for quite a distance. Reed is worried it's the police, but I'm worried it's something else. We decided to hide under a large tree and ditch our beer there. As we were on the ground, we started to see blue lights in the distance. They're swinging like someone is carrying them. However, they're maybe 7 foot in the air. And the blue lights stay a few feet away and then slowly leave. They swing the whole time, as if they're looking for something. After what seems like a very long time, Reed and I decided we were safe enough and we should go back to campus. We ran the rest of the way down the hill and get to the upper parking lot. As we get to the parking lot, we see our friend Alton heading to the woods with some beer. We called out to him and he came over to say hello. I asked him when he had left the bonfire. I was kind of confused. He looked at us equally confused. Alton tells us that his paper took longer than expected. He's just heading out to the bonfire now with the beer he had planned on bringing with him the whole time. Reed and I are freaked out and decided to call it a night and just went home. I still think about this night. It was one of the oddest days in my entire life. Who did I have a beer with?
I used to work at a cheese factory on the edge of a cornfield in southwestern Minnesota. I was working nights at the time. It was 2 or 3 a.m. and I was out on the loading dock watching bats fly around the floodlights. I liked being out in the cool night air. And the corn was about as high as my shoulder at the time, so about 5 foot 10 inches. As I was watching the bats, I looked down at the edge of the cornfield. Something was moving there. It was the size of a small child, and very, very skinny. Pale, with something that looked like a head of straight black hair. It moved in a sort of jerky gait, like someone dancing the robot badly. It moved in chunks, legs, then hips, and torso, shoulders, neck, and finally head. It was looking back into the cornfield, or at least I felt like it was. I felt prickly all over. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a heron or something at first, but it looked too much like a person. It didn't move like a person though. Gradually, step by step, it moved towards me. Letting my curiosity better my fear, I moved towards the edge of the dock, which was raised a few feet off the ground to connect with the semis. When I got within a few feet of the edge, the thing looked at me. I was paralyzed. I could have run, but I was stuck somewhere between terrified and intrigued. It started to move again. Its face still pointed at me. It ratcheted its body in that disconcerting, jerky movement towards the cornfield and went into it. I tried to watch where the field moved as it passed, but the corn remained perfectly still. I also noticed that all the crickets were silent. After a few minutes, nothing happened. I stood out there for over an hour, but it never came back, and I never saw it again. I'm kind of glad. It was a cold evening. I had my two nieces with me. One was 6 and the other 8. I had gone to our family cabin, waiting on my sister to return from town. The evening started around 7 p.m., and we didn't have a key to the house, so we waited for a couple hours and the girls eventually fell asleep in my truck. As the night grew later, the temperature also dropped. I fell asleep as well, but woke up around 9:30 p.m. It was very cold in the truck, so I started the vehicle. As I depressed the brake pedal to start the truck, I noticed in the side mirror a face looking at me from the glow in the taillight. I hesitated at first, but gathered enough courage to look. I saw a white face with long gray-whitish hair and black eyes looking at me. I freaked out, started the truck and sped off, heading to the highway, not sure if what I saw was following us. It was, though. I felt it jump into the bed of my truck. I turned west to head towards the nearest town, and I went as fast as I could to my parents' house. Upon reaching the turnoff, I noticed it jump out of the truck and run along the right-of-way fence. As I pulled up to the house, I quickly carried my nieces inside. Once there, I situated them for bed. Later that night, I dreamed that I walked about 2 miles to my aunt's house and no one was home. As I walked back, I noticed this thing was following me. I quickly ran home, went inside, and locked the door behind me and went to bed. When I woke up the next morning, I noticed sand and dirt at the foot of my bed. I told my parents of what had happened and what I dreamed about. They took me to a medicine man, and he told me that I had actually been sleepwalking and had walked to my aunt's house. And when I entered her home, this thing followed me in. I'll try to be as accurate as possible. This happened 12 years ago, so some details are blurred. My girlfriend at the time lived in a small ranch-style house on the tip of a long acreage plot. I would often take my shotgun and fishing pole to the large pond on the back of the property. It was close to the fence marking the property line. I'm sitting next to the pond, just casting and reeling for some carp, when I get this strange wave of fear. It was an instantaneous, oh fuck feeling that I've only ever experienced once before when I saw that I was about to wreck my car. Well, I reeled up my line and attached the lure to the catch on the bottom when I heard leaves rustling down by the bank to my right. I leaned out past the tree I was next to and could clearly see leaves being kicked up by something, but there was nothing there. I could see the leaves moving, but I could not see anything else. For a couple moments, I thought it was just a rodent under all the dead leaves. I let out a sigh of relief and whatever was moving froze. At this point, the adrenaline was making me a little shaky, but I wanted to walk over and see what was moving around in the leaves. When I picked up my shotgun, I chambered a shell just in case it was a snake or something. There are a lot of copperheads on our property. As soon as the shell clicked into place, this thing took a step behind the tree it was closest to. Almost see an outline of this thing, like when you record over an old VHS and you can still see the previous movie just a little bit. The outline was humanoid. It leaned out from behind the tree and stared at me. Me, being a moron, said, "I see you watching me." This thing gets startled and ducks back behind the tree. This is when I realized It was intelligent in some way at least, and I started to go into full panic mode. I fired a shell at the tree and took off running back to the house. It's about 3/4 of a mile back and my ears were ringing like crazy from the shot. I slowed down to a trot to catch my breath and compose myself and try to think of an excuse to explain why I fired a round at it. That's when I heard it. This thing was running at me, and its footfall was incredibly heavy. It honestly sounded like a football player, with that plastic on plastic sound the pads make. I racked another round and fire where I think I heard it. At this point it seemed completely invisible. I take off towards the house again, and my girlfriend and her younger brother are just inside the entrance to the pasture I was in. They are probably about 200 yards off when she screams and points to my left, and her brother run back to the house. I finally clear the gate and slam it behind me before the final sprint to the house. When I got inside, she told me she could see dirt and leaves being absolutely torn up behind me but couldn't see anything. Her brother confirmed this, and I felt nauseated from the fact that they saw something too. It still makes me a little shaky to think about it. The next morning, we all went out together in the field. I wanted to find its tracks, and I swear to God it looked like it had covered them up. We only ever found a few indentations around the tree I spotted it at, but even those had been scuffed and covered in leaves and pine needles. My dad used to get up around 3 a.m. every morning for work. Starting at a very early age, I would wake up on my own and wander downstairs to see him before he left. One morning, when I was about 4 years old, I made it to the bottom of the stairs and noticed that the front door was ajar. I opened it up and saw my father in his favorite work shirt making his way down the driveway to his truck in his typical work outfit, a plaid shirt and dickies. I swung the door open wide and yelled for him to come back for a hug before he left. He slowly turned around and just stared at me, then finally started walking back towards the house. He was acting so strangely towards me, and it started to scare me, and I began crying and asking what was wrong. Just as he had almost reached me, a pair of arms encircled me from behind in a great bear hug. I turned my head to see my understandably freaked out father staring at his doppelganger in the same outfit. The double took one look at my dad and started running down the driveway. Meanwhile, my dad yanked me in the house and locked the door. It was the weirdest morning ever. I never did quite figure out what happened. I would not trust my 4-year-old memory of the event if it wasn't also witnessed by my father. He won't really talk about it these days, but my mom has since told me that he called off work, and she spent the day reassuring him that he wasn't crazy. My freshman year of high school, I was going through a negative phase. My mom would describe me as constantly yelling at her and fighting my younger brothers all the time. She said she would pray every day hoping I would change. She told me she was scared that one day I'll get massively out of control and that she'll have to call the police on me. This story happened around summer of 2011. I had just ended my freshman year of high school. It was around 1:30 in the morning. I used to sleep with the door open back then. I randomly woke up and looked at the clock. A few minutes later, I heard faint footsteps. At first, I was thinking this was just in my head. After a few minutes, I started to look around, as I usually do whenever I wake up. I heard the footsteps again. but this time they sounded like they were literally outside my room. In my peripheral vision, I noticed that I couldn't see into my brother's room. He also used to sleep with the door open, and his room is right across from mine. It was as if something was standing in front of or blocking the entryway. I got curious and turned to see what was blocking it, and I saw a humanoid figure about 7 feet tall. It was faceless, bald, and had a fair skin complexion. It was dressed in an old-fashioned attire. It had a cream-colored sweater with what appeared to be random paint strokes and splashes of many colors on it. It also had black pants. It was just standing there, as if it was looking at me. I started analyzing it. It was abnormally thin and had freakishly long arms. They were way past the knee. It also had visible veins running all over its faceless expression. I thought I was dreaming at first. I started blinking, shaking my head and slapping myself in hopes that I was dreaming or hallucinating. I stopped and looked across the hall. It was still standing there. I immediately freaked out when I found out I was not dreaming and pulled the covers over my face. I tried yelling for help, but I couldn't scream from all the terror. 30 minutes or so later, I built up enough courage and pulled the covers off to confront it, but by this time, it was gone. I told my mom about it the next day. She said that ever since I saw that thing, I started to change. I haven't seen it ever since. My youngest brother also happened to see the thing earlier this year. I don't know what this thing could have possibly been, and I know it wasn't sleep paralysis because I was able to move around. Alright, so it was 1996. I was in high school at the time, and I used to be into gangbanging, me and my cousin. So one day, we're just hanging out at this spot with the gang or whatever. We used to go at it a lot with this Asian gang. Well, one of them came up and he's mouthing off something and shows us his gun. My cousin carries guns too and all that, and he was always crazy about saying, "If you're gonna show me your gun, you better use it." He didn't play like that. So we go after this guy. He turns down this alleyway and so did we. My cousin pulls his gun out, and it's starting to get really real out here. He shoots it and hits this kid. So we went up to the body, the reason being my cousin wanted to take his gun. So we go up to the body, and the Asian kid, in front of our eyes, starts changing. His skin starts turning green and rough, like alligator type skin. It scared us to death, man. My cousin asked if the thing was dead. I mean, well, as far as we knew, it was dead. He looked at me, I looked at him, and we booked it right the hell out of there. To this day, only me and him know what happened. My cousin asked me if I noticed his eyes and asked if they were snake-like or anything. I had seen them. They were more like a fly's eyes, like a bug's. The eyes had like a strange color. I still can't believe it. We were throwing up after it all happened. We were so freaked out. My cousin ended up being killed a few years later. That's what made me do some changes in my life and start doing the right thing. Whenever he was killed, reality really hit me. Before we get started, I want to make sure everybody knows I'm still looking for stories from subscribers for a special video. So if you have any that you would like to share, be sure to send them to me on Facebook or Twitter. The links are in the video description below. I also want to say thanks to everybody who watches these videos. The channel's been around about a year and a half now and just hit 50 videos not too long ago. I'd like to get the channel going as good as it was before I had to take a break from YouTube. So make sure to keep liking these videos, leave your thoughts and recommendations in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't. Thanks again, everybody. Now let's get started. I'm 27 now, but when I was 17, just weeks from being 18, I lived in a small town in Missouri. I had saved up a good 4 years worth of paychecks and sold my TV to buy a used motorcycle. It was my dream bike. I went and bought it, and my father helped me get it home to our house because I wasn't legally able to ride it for another few weeks. I remember when we got home, I put it in our barn and locked the barn door because we didn't have a garage. I don't remember why I did it. It's a very small town and we knew pretty much everyone, and our closest neighbors are hours away. I fell asleep around 10 or 11 p.m. and woke up about 3 in the morning because I heard a large bang near the barn. I thought it was one of the horses that might have gotten spooked or something, so I went outside to check. I always carry a folding blade with me, and when I got to the barn, it was still locked. There are no windows besides one way at the top, but it's a good 15 feet high and there was no ladder. I unlocked the door and walked into the barn. My new used bike was on the floor. I heard some kind of crunching, chewing noise, so I instinctively grabbed my knife. There was just enough light to reflect off the polished metal. I peeked into the animal pen, and I kid you not, there was something squatted over the horse. It had to have killed it because all of our animals were very healthy and we took very good care of them. I've seen wolves eat animals before, but this wasn't like that. It looked like that thing from the Lord of the Rings, that cave-dwelling creature thing, only much taller. I know it was only a couple of seconds, but it felt like minutes of me being frozen there. Whatever it was turned and looked at me, and I turned and sprinted back to the house screaming at the top of my lungs. It was chasing me at this point. It ran on all fours and screeched like worn brakes on a heavy vehicle. I must have awoken my dad. He met me at the door with his gun loaded and fired 2 shots in its direction. He then shoved me inside and shut the door. It seemed scared of the shots, and we later dialed the police, though they found nothing. It still haunts me, and I don't live anywhere near there now. I live in Illinois. This is a sighting I had on October 25th of last year. We were walking through a trail in the woods at about 10 at night. While walking through, we heard a weird screeching sound. Almost like a tree squeaking, which is what we thought it was since we were in the woods. But it seemed to follow us everywhere we went. We left for a little bit and came back into the woods on the same trail. And there it was on the side of the trail, crouched down, facing us, just staring at us. It wasn't making the noise that we heard earlier, though. I think it was only about 5 feet tall, but that's just an estimation. It was crouched down and standing around 3.5 feet tall there. It was completely gray. My 2 friends thought that it didn't have fur, but I thought it had really short fur. The arms were very human-like, and I saw the hands had 5 fingers. But the legs looked more like frog legs. I couldn't see its feet, just the shape and direction the legs were going. I couldn't recognize what the face looked like, but from what I could tell, it had slanted, fully black eyes, and its head wasn't very large compared to its body. It was close to the same body proportions as a human, but slightly off. The head, though, that was a completely different shape. It was more like a square, with one point on each side of the head. I don't know if they were ears or something else. Its torso was mostly covered up by its arms and legs, so I can't really explain that, but it looked muscular. Its arms were very defined and a little muscular. It tilted its head and stared at us, almost like it was in alarm or frozen, and it didn't make a sound. We turned our backs to it and ran. This was kinda stupid, I think, because we were in shock, because no one knew what it was, but when we looked back, we couldn't see it. I think maybe us running and all the noise may have startled it away. To give a little context to this story, all of my family was in and they had filled up the house, and instead of sleeping on the couch, I would stay in my grandparents' fifth-wheeled camper. I had my own space and was able to stay up as late as I wanted watching TV without anyone waking up. About 50 or 60 feet from the camper was a streetlight my grandfather had installed near his machine shop, so the yard was always slightly lit in the front. I was watching TV, and out of nowhere I hear my grandparents' Great Danes raising hell, outside barking and running all over the yard. There's an underground electrical fence, so they can't reach past the house. I look through the blinds and see them chasing something around. It was a small black object darting across the ground about a foot wide and very short. I thought it was a rabbit at first. This thing was leaving them in the dust, darting all over to avoid them. Then suddenly it darts directly under the street lamp and goes from being about 6 inches tall to well over 6 foot. It was slim and lanky looking. I stared at it for a few seconds trying to make out defining features, but it was like trying to focus on a shadow. It had no defining facial features, it was just all black like a silhouette. All I could see was the outline of some kind of bipedal creature. It turned towards the dogs and arched its back and let out some kind of scream that I can only describe as a banshee, a wail piercing and deafening. The dogs started whimpering and ran to their doghouse. Then it turned to directly where I was looking from. Even though I couldn't see its eyes, I knew it was looking right at me. I was frozen in place, petrified by fear. It turned towards the road and cleared the rest of the yard into the woods, which is about 60 meters in less than a few seconds. I sat in the recliner in the camper with knives in both hands, spinning in a circle, scared for my life that it would come back. I never slept in that camper again. The dogs wouldn't come out of their doghouse for close to 3 days. Every time we would try to go in and try to get them out, they would snap at us and crawl back to the farthest corner of the kettle. I don't think I'll ever know what that creature was. On the last day of my camp retreat in Wisconsin, me and my friend were walking up our cabin to go get our sweatshirts because it was a bit chilly. My cabin is in the middle of 2 other cabins right next to the woods. It is a public campsite and people come and go as they please. The woods we were next to go on for miles and miles, and there are no known people living in there as far as anyone knows. So me and my friends proceed to the cabin while the rest of the campers and staff are walking back for night games. We reach the top of the hill and take our flashlights out to see where our cabin is. When I reach for the handle of our door, my friend says, "Hey, that looks just like a guy," while pointing to the woods. I turned to see that there was indeed something that looked like a person. We chuckled, thinking it's just part of a tree. But as we look, we start to notice it's some kind of humanoid figure watching us. Its height was abnormal, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. It had long, human-like arms and its body was grayish, but its neck was completely white. We looked at each other shocked and started to back up slowly while still shining the flashlight on the creature. It slowly raised its arms and moved towards us, and that's when we booked it down the hill as fast as we could. Later on that night, the staff patrolled to make sure nothing else happened around the campus. They came back to our cabin while I was calming down my friends and tell us they saw some movement near our cabins, but he couldn't tell us what it was. That night still haunts me to this day. Before the retreat, my brother noticed something peeking through the main cabin window, but before he could get a good look at it, it backed into the darkness. He only got to see its eyes, and they were far from human. My brother's close friend even heard something trying to mimic the bullfrogs while he was in the porta potty. But whenever this creature would show up, all the birds and frogs were silent. The first day of our retreat, me and my brother also had heard a loud, dog-like growl. There's no one on this earth who can make a sound as real as that is what we heard, and there have been no dogs seen anywhere. I'm a Christian, so I think it could be a demon, but I'm still pondering and wondering what this thing really is. I was fairly young when this happened. It occurred at my home in southeastern Massachusetts. At the time, my sister, who is several years younger than me, was sick with a cold. Just before bed, my parents were trying to get her to take her medicine. They had just gotten it from the doctor and they were having difficulty getting her to take it. She didn't like the taste. My dad was trying everything, including mixing my sister's medicine with her formula, but to no avail. My mother held her and tried to calm her down. Since they were having such a difficult time with my sister, my dad asked me to do the nightly rounds that he always did before bed. Make sure the door was locked, pull down the shades, and shut the lights off in the different rooms. We had 2 very large windows in our living room, one on the left wall and one on the front wall facing the street. This story has to do with the left wall. This window faces only my driveway and the adjacent neighbor's front yard, but at the time we had a very large bush that grew past the top of the window and blocked the entirety of the view outside. The way the roots grew, however, there was enough space to crawl under the bush. I don't really remember how much standing room was there because we tore it down years ago. But I do remember I had no problem standing behind the bush while playing hide and seek as a child. Anyway, I listened to my dad, and the first thing I did was go pull down the shade covering this left window. I remember our dining room table was right in front of it. I got on a chair and started to pull down the shade when I saw what I told my dad was a mud man. It was a very intimidating looking creature, probably around 6 feet tall. Its skin, or at least what I presume was skin, was brown. The creature looked like it was covered entirely in mud, and aside from the mud, it had 2 medium-sized tusks protruding straight up from its lower jaw, similar looking to walrus tusks, but they were sticking up from the lower jaw rather than down from the upper jaw. I also remember them being smaller in proportion to its head than a walrus has. The creature also had yellowed eyes. They weren't glowing or bright or anything like that, just yellow in color. I also noticed that it was bipedal. It was clearly standing up. I don't think it was on hind legs because it had a fairly straight back, almost resembling a human's posture. After this, I ran and told my dad, who hushed me and sent me to bed. I remember talking about it the next morning because I was still scared. We checked out the area for evidence and didn't see anything. I hope I never see it again. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't. Let me know what you think about these creatures, and do you have an idea of what they could be? I'd be really interested to know. I'll be back with a new video in a couple of days, so until next time.